Until then, Wagner. 3 recordings of Die Walküre. 2 Valkyries from brand new productions, Netherlands Opera in Amsterdam in 2005, conducted by Hartmut Haenchen, and from Adelaide a year earlier, the State Opera of South Australia's production, conducted by Asher Fisch. Now, these are the first 2 ring cycles recorded on SACD in surround sound. And the third Valkyrie is from the source, Bayreuth, 1955. Joseph Keilberth conducting. This was the recording that was supposed to be the first stereo ring cycle, until it was shelved to make way for Scholte's studio ring and never officially released before due to contractual issues. All 3 of these recordings were made live, and Christopher Wintell, who teaches opera at King's College in London, has been listening to them for us. You might have heard me talking to producer Maria van Dam a couple of weeks ago about the recording of the Adelaide Ring. Here's a reminder of what they achieved, with a Dutchman as Wotan, John Bruchele. Part of the Australian ring cycle, Die Walküre. That's John Bruchele at the end of Act 2 as Wotan, and Christopher Wintell. We have these 3 recordings here. Bayreuth 1955, live with Keilberth. We have the Dutch ring cycle, Die Walküre from that, and this one from Adelaide in 2004. It gives us an opportunity to compare some, well, very different ideas, very different productions and different voices. What was your reaction to having these 3 in front of you?
Well, I thought all 3 were really quite different. The Bayreuth production, it has to be said, is quite exceptional. It's got a wonderful Wotan in Hans Hotter, and his conception of the role is tremendously moving, and this is a wonderful document to have. The Australian production is thrillingly performed under Asher Fisch. It's got a strong cast. It's got an exceptional Siegmund in Stuart Skelton. And I thoroughly enjoyed the orchestral playing, which takes more time than the Bayreuth production and is a little more relaxed, but still it flows wonderfully. The Netherlands production is a bit special because it's the first production ever to be based on the new Wagner Collected Edition, and it heeds instructions of Wagner from the time of the first ring that aren't included in the printed score, and those deal mainly with tempo and tone.
Now, in terms of the productions themselves, should we start with Bayreuth, 1955? We've got Astrid Varnay and Hans Hotter in imperious form, I think it's fair to say. And this is Hans Hotter a decade before he recorded Wotan for the Schulte Ring, which was the reason this one's never been released for many reasons, officially anyway. And sounding younger, more thrilling, more absolutely in control of the role. How different are these three Wotans? Do you get a sense of different visions of the role?
I certainly do, because on the one hand, Hans Hotter is every bit as flexible. On the other hand, you find that Albert Domen goes for tremendous power in the Netherlands production, and in the South Australian production, you've got John Bröckele, who gives a rather tight, rather gnarled performance. He's unremitting and suffers in a different way to Hans Hotter. And
with Bröckele, it's a rougher sound at times, but also a tremendous fury as well. There's rage in this voice, isn't there, sometimes?
Yes, of course. On one hand, you've got the cosmic rage, but on the other hand, in the great scene with Brunhilde, you've got an incredible variety of emotions. He has to pick himself up from nothing after he's been scolded by Fricka. Shame, pity, foreboding, frustration, nihilistic self-contempt. And that is what Hans Hotter does extremely well. Let's listen to the half-whispered opening with narration in the second scene of the second act.
Wünsche wüten gejagt, gewann ich ihr die Welt. Unwissend trugvoll, untreue lügt ich, band durch Verträge was unheilbar. Ist ich verlockte mich woge, ihr Schweigen nun verschwand.
Hans Hotter in the Bayreuth 1955 production of Die Walküre. Hotter as Wotan, conducted by Keilberth. And, of course, Wotan is absolutely the key role to this opera. It has to be right, and having somebody of Hotter's quality here is Miles. What about the slighter roles, though, the Siegmunds and Sieglinders? How well cast are they?
Well, there's a very special challenge, you know, in this first act, because it's not an act like any other act, either in Wagner or in any other opera, because three things really go on. One is there is this extraordinary story of a man coming in from the evening. He's been in a fight, he's rather wounded, he's tended by the wife of Hunding. Gradually they've discovered that they're brother and sister, and then by the end of the act they are becoming lovers. That's the first level. The second level is that the whole thing has been stage managed by Wotan. He is the magician behind the scenes, pulling all the strings, making sure that the moonlight comes in the right moment, the beams come out of the fire and whatever, so that they're not free agents at all. And thirdly, as listeners, we realise that we are seeing reenactments of parts of Das Rheingold. So the pulling of the sword and the pledge that goes with it parallels what Albrecht does at the beginning of Rheingold. So there's a sort of triple level of consciousness. Now, the best productions are those that have got that sense that uncanny things are happening, as opposed to singing through a realist drama or something like that. And I particularly liked the performance, again from Bayreuth, of the first act, because this had an urgency about it and a tremendous Sieglinde in Gräbruvenstein. She sweeps all before her, and there's a wonderful response to Siegfried's Moonlight Spring Song.
That's the voice of Gray Bernstein as Sieglinde in the 1955 Bayreuth production conducted by Joseph Keilberth, released on Testament. Now, Christopher Wintell, we focus on Wotan as the main character and the controlling force behind every little thing that happens, but Wagner named the opera after the Valkyrie, after Brunhilde.
He certainly did. And the big moment in the opera is for Brunhilde, when she announces to Sieglinde that Sieglinde will have the child, and that will be the great hero. And we might listen to that particular moment, because that's especially interesting with regard to the Netherlands performance. As we said earlier, that the Netherlands performance is based on Wagner's own instructions, and Wagner made a particular point about tempi. He said, don't pull back the tempi for the sake of sentiment, press on, keep the thing going. But he did make a big exception at the moment in Act 3 when Brunhilde announces to Sieglinde that she does bear this hero, and when Sieglinde responds with rapture. And it is when Sieglinde responds to what Brunhilde says that there's a huge pulling back in the orchestra. Now, this is peculiar to the Netherlands production and is hugely effective.
You just heard Linda Watson as Brunhilde and Charlotte Margione responding as Sieglinde from the Netherlands production of Die Walküre. And Christopher Wintell, how much difference is there between the Brunhildes? Because we're dealing with the 1955 right through to 2005.
Well, you could start with the Brunhilde's first appearance, because Brunhilde's entrance aria is not like anyone else's. She sings this Valkyrie music, and she's got a huge challenge from the moment she opens her mouth. The rhythm has got to be strict, the intonation has got to be pin sharp, she's got to make her glissandi, which rise through the octave, she's got to make those hit the target, and she's got a problem between controlling the vibrato so it's not too wide, so that the trilled note will actually sound. Now, I thought of the three, all rose to it in their own ways, but Astrid Varney seemed to get the measure of the things best. But the challenges really are superhuman.
Astrid Varney as Brunhilde at Bayreuth in 1955, rising to the, well, literally superhuman challenges, as you were saying, Christopher Wintell, of the role. And what about the Brunhilde of the Adelaide ring, the Australian Walküre? This is Lisa Gastine. So how does she actually measure up to the role?
I thought she was tremendously impressive in the second act, and never more so than in the fourth scene, when she and Siegmund have this famous encounter. She arrives to tell him that he's going to die in the battle. The music is statuesque and controlled, and she's marvellous at that. By the end of the act, she has changed her mind. She's going to defend him, and the music goes wild. And the change of intensity across the act is marvellously done. There's a very interesting thing in that, because although you've got a transition from one stage to another, as everybody knows was Wagner's aim always, you have the second thing that Karl Dahlhaus used to say about Wagner, that although you've got this transition, you also have the big body blows that come in the middle of scenes. And this is marvellously done in this scene, because the body blow is the moment Brunhilde says to Siegmund, "You're going to die," and it's a tremendous blow to him. And the way that Stuart Skelton reacts to her, first of all, by deflecting the blow and turning to his sleeping sister and feeling for her, before raging against Wotan and all the gods. The whole of that passage, I think, is extremely well done in the Australian production.
geschieht mir sie, deine Trauer trotz ich mit ihm. Sie wird schon, geschieht jetzt tot, seine Trauer wird nein, schrecklich schlummernde nicht. Was das Weib, du traurigster aller Getreuen. Gegen dich wütet in Waffen die Welt, und ist dem du einzig vertraut, für den du einzig getrotzt, mit meinem Schutz, nicht soll ich dich schirmen, die kühne Verraterin Kampf erstanden. Und schweren Schoß beschieden mich Schimpf für sie. Auf sich den Fall, nicht wahr, ich verfall, halte mich fest.
Part of the Adelaide performance of Wagner's Die Walküre, and you heard Lisa Gastine and Stuart Skelton as Brunhilde and Siegmund in that extract, and it's Asher Fisch conducting the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra and State Opera of South Australia in that recording. We haven't really talked about the recording quality, actually, Christopher, because, all of these three are, we're eavesdropping on productions, and that comes with its own set of problems. You know, you have to make it some way presentable, repeatable as a perfectly valid recording of the opera, but it also has to be honest to the production and to the event. Do they all work? Do you get a real sense of atmosphere from all three of these?
I get a sense of atmosphere, but I think the atmosphere is really quite different. The Bayreuth production is urgent and is close, but it has got a certain amount of noise from the stage action which you have to live with a bit. There are some inaccuracies. I think in modern production would want to go back and change some things.
You certainly have to put up some scruffy ensemble, don't you, from time to time, and some sort of inexact playing.
We would think of it as an archive recording from that point of view. On the other hand, the Australian production has most beautiful playing, and I was especially struck by the Wind, the Cor Anglais playing is extraordinarily expressive and soulful.
It's funny, I was really struck by that as well, because when I listened to Walküre from Adelaide, I wasn't expecting that quality of playing and that quality of recording. It really does rather knock your socks off, doesn't it?
The orchestra's hugely powerful and utterly thrilling, yes.
And the Netherlands performance, it's sort of almost in the round. I've heard some of the singers talking about it, and they said that actually it was very interesting because they had a very different kind of dialogue with the instrumentalists and with the orchestra, because they were effectively on stage with them. But it does cause some balance problems. Sometimes the orchestra does overpower the singers. But do you get a feeling of the production itself? Is that an important part of the Netherlands one, or are you able to sort of separate yourself from it and just listen to it as an idealised performance of Wagner?
There is a DVD, and there is a question with the Netherlands whether you would prefer to see the DVD rather than hear the CD recording. What you say is perfectly true. It is a record of a live performance of an extraordinary nature.
And we should say that the DVD of that Netherlands ring is on Opus Arte, and it's not actually the same soundtrack. It's a different mix for the audio-only one. We should make that point. But it's well worth looking at. It's an unusual and very interesting, almost non-set performance of the ring. But it's on Opus Arte if you want to investigate that. Christopher, there are always going to be people who will automatically gravitate towards Bayreuth, 1955, part of a real tradition of Wagner performance at the shrine that Wagner created for his own works, effectively. And to them it's going to represent a golden age, a kind of cast which couldn't possibly be replicated today as far as they're concerned. And yet here we have two brand new productions coming at the work from radically different ways in terms of the production values, and also one introducing this new Wagner edition and therefore attempting to get us closer to what Wagner would have expected himself than perhaps even they were able to produce for Keilberth in 1955 in Bayreuth. So, where do you stand on this idea of tradition and modernity?
In Wagner performance, there is both the spirit and the letter. Now, there's a cliché which says you must almost relate the part to the whole, the detail to the great vision, and I think you could only say that about a very few composers. In the last 150 years, you would say about Wagner, Richard Strauss, and also about Benjamin Britten. Now, the great performances seem to me not to lose the sense of the big sweep. And at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people were very concerned with surges and waveforms, even to the point where they say that the surging and the waving is the essence of the music, whereas the details and the notes really fit round it. That is, as far as I'm concerned, the centrepiece of a great tradition. And there again, in 1955, you've got a wonderful sense of force and direction. You've got the same thing again in the Australian production, but it comes out rather differently.
And we've had some interesting conversations going on the CD Review message board over the last week about, coming down to nationality and performance tradition, and there will always be people who will maintain that a Germanic ring from Bayreuth is always going to have an innate superiority to productions put on anywhere else in the world.
That depends upon how you think of Wagner's musical personality. Like all great geniuses, many things have gone into it. There are French elements, there are Italian elements, and the German elements. And when you hear conductors of different nationalities performing it, then inevitably a different side of Wagner will come forward. So I would not expect to say that I think any one nationality should win through.
Well, getting back to the three new recordings we have in front of us, very different productions, is there one moment, one passage, Christopher, which stands out to you from any of these three as being a particularly remarkable achievement?
I think Wagner would have pointed to the very end of the work, where Wotan says farewell to Brunhilde at the end of Act 3, because Wotan's farewell to Brunhilde brings together some of the central images and most important images for him from the Western theatrical tradition. It's Creon punishing Antigone, Lear banishing Cordelia, and it matters more than anything else, and it's hugely poignant because of Wagner's identification with Wotan. And I think this is best done and most movingly done by Hans Hotter in Bayreuth, because he's able to bring the two aspects of Wotan together quite magically. On the one hand, there is the god with all his superhuman force, and on the other hand, there is the suffering mortal who has, ironically, turned Brunhilde into a mortal who, of course, will suffer in due course. And those two sides of Wotan emerge in this farewell.
The end of Die Walküre, the Valkyrie, and for my guest Christopher Wintell, perhaps the absolute highlight of all three of the recordings of Wagner's opera we've been listening to. Hans Hotter as Wotan, achieving wonders live at Bayreuth in 1955 as part of the ring cycle conducted by Ears of Keilberth. That first stereo ring has been released by the Testament label. Die Walküre is a 4-disc set, which you can find on sale in the region of £40, with good notes about the recording rather than the opera and full libretto with English translation. It sounds remarkably vivid for its age, but of course for sheer sonic impact it's still some distance from the Australian ring on Melba recordings. Rheingold and Valkyrie released so far. Die Walküre is nearer to the £50 mark for the 4 hybrid SACDs. Synopsis, libretto and translation there as well. Finally, the Netherlands Opera's Ring in Amsterdam. Again, Rheingold and Die Walküre are the operas that have been released to date, again as hybrid SACDs, capturing, as I hope you were able to hear even in the stereo excerpts we just played you, something of a rather special production. The Dutch Valkyrie is also a 4-disc set, the first to use the new Richard Wagner edition, and although there are quite a few words about this in the notes, there's no libretto with that one.